I think that the actual fighting will not last beyond 2025. The Russians will capture more territory than they now control, and there will be, let's call it a ceasefire, and the end result will be this frozen conflict. But you will not have a genuine peace agreement, and therefore there will always be present the danger that that frozen conflict will once again become a hot conflict. And the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, won't accept a final peace agreement where Russia captures a significant portion of Ukrainian territory. This is a very depressing situation because there is really no end in sight to the conflict between the two sides. It's an acute hostility, a deep hostility will exist for a long, long time. When NATO decided to expand in the 1990s, there was a big battle inside the United States. Opponents of NATO expansion, who were basically realists, who said that if you expand NATO eastward, you're going to antagonize Russia and you're going to end up at some point with a serious conflict. And they were opposed by a large number of liberals who believed that the United States was a benign hegemon and that the United States could move NATO eastward toward Russia and that it would not lead to trouble. So what happens in the 1990s is that NATO expansion begins. The first major expansion occurs in 1999, and then the second major expansion occurs in 2004. Very importantly, then in April 2008, NATO, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, says that Ukraine will be brought into NATO. The Russians make it unequivocally clear at the time that that is not going to happen, that Ukraine in NATO represents an existential threat to Moscow. Nevertheless, the United States and NATO more generally continue to push eastward and continue to try to bring Ukraine into NATO. In February of 2014, a major crisis breaks out. And this is when I wrote my famous article in Foreign Affairs that said that the West was responsible for the crisis. And I said the principal cause of the crisis was NATO expansion, and more generally, the West's effort to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. The United States and its allies double down and continue to push to bring Ukraine into NATO. And every time the Russians try to work out some sort of negotiated agreement to avoid this happening, the Americans and their allies refuse to negotiate with the Russians. And in February of 2022, 8 years after the conflict broke out in February of 2014, the Russians invade Ukraine. The conventional wisdom in the West is that Putin started the war because he's basically an imperialist or an expansionist. And what he's interested in doing is creating a greater Russia. What Putin wants to do is conquer Ukraine, all of Ukraine, and then he's going to conquer other countries in Eastern Europe. My argument is that this view is wrong, and that what Putin was doing when he attacked Ukraine was launching a preventive war. The reason had nothing to do with his imperial ambitions. It had everything to do with the fact that he viewed NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat to Russia. So I have a view that is directly at odds with the conventional wisdom. And you ask me, how would I show that I'm right and the conventional wisdom is wrong? And the answer is very simple. There is zero evidence to support the conventional wisdom. There is no evidence that Putin wanted to create a greater Russia. There is no evidence that he wanted to conquer all of Ukraine. And on the other hand, there is an abundance of evidence that he was motivated by NATO expansion into Ukraine, or more generally, he was motivated by the West's efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. It's very clear that the sanctions have failed almost completely. It's quite remarkable. The Americans thought, once the war started, that economic sanctions, coupled with the Ukrainian army's early victories on the battlefield, would allow Ukraine to defeat Russia inside of Ukraine. And the sanctions were considered to be a war-winning weapon against Russia. But they have completely failed. The Russian economy is doing very well. And if anything, it's the European economies that have been hurt by the sanctions. Now, the question is, how is the United States reacting to this? Is the United States facing up to reality and pushing the Ukrainians to negotiate a settlement with Russia? The answer is no. I think the United States wants to continue the war for the foreseeable future in the hope that at some point the West will somehow, working with the Ukrainians, be able to reverse the situation on the battlefield and help Ukraine recover its lost territories. This is not going to happen. In fact, it's delusional thinking. It would make much more sense for the Ukrainians to try to work out some sort of settlement with the Russians now. But that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because the West won't quit. And it appears, at least for the time being, that the Ukrainians are not going to quit either.